Massachusetts stay-at-home advisory will last at least until May 18th. Governor Charlie Baker made the announcement today that he's extending that guidance, non-essential business closures, and the ban on gatherings of 10 people or more.
We're all incredibly eager to move on from this phase of our lives. But if we act too soon, we could risk a spike in infections that could force our state to revert to serious restrictions again. And this scenario would be far worse for our economy and for our communities and for our people.
The governor also announced the creation of a reopening advisory board, which will come up with a phased plan to safely start to return to business over the coming weeks and months. But even before today's announcement, Boston Mayor Marty Walsh had said it was much too early to be talking about reopening, at least in his city right now, telling CNN's and fellow Dorchesterite John King it's still very much in the middle of the peak.
I do think it's important for us to err on the side of caution, to continue to take very drastic steps in order to keep these numbers down, keep people safe.
The mayor also told me and Marjorie Egan last week on Boston Public Radio that early summer is a more likely transition period and that it will be far from business as usual when that starts. When it comes to how the city has been tackling this pandemic, it's taken a village. Back in late March, when Boston was seeing its first deaths from the virus, Walsh decided to bring in outside help to oversee the response. The McChrystal Group, run by retired four-star Army General Stanley McChrystal, who joins me now. General, it's good to meet you. Thanks so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Did Governor Baker make the right decision today with that extension of the shutdown?
Well, I can't really judge that. I would just say that the key thing is getting information from across all the players, so that people understand what the reality is and what needs to happen.
You know, you have led efforts against some of the most intractable enemies imaginable, terrorism in another part of the world, the virus here. Are there common threads through those efforts, General?
Well, there absolutely is. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which we first faced starting in 2003, was an amorphous viral-like enemy. It was nowhere and it was everywhere. A little bit like COVID-19. And it takes a whole of society approach to fight it. It's a wartime approach, but not just military. And it's getting all the different pieces working together that's so important.
I'm glad to hear you say that. But one major difference, it seems to me, is that when you made a decision, the men and women who worked under you had to do what you suggested. When Mayor Walsh urges people to do it, there's some bully pulpit impact, but it's not a mandate. Why haven't we taken that extra step in Boston, and should we?
Well, I'm not sure. I think that in reality, Mayor Walsh brings a lot of credibility and legitimacy. And what he's done is been able to serve the citizens of Boston effectively. And over time, what that does is it makes people understand that it's in their best interest to cooperate. And so I think he's done really a magnificent job of cobbling the pieces together. And if you think about it, it's not just facing an unprecedented threat. It's doing it at a time when we've got to work dispersed, a lot of people working from home, which makes it much more difficult.
Speaking of working from home, if people hear a strange sound in the background, that is your grandchild. Is that not correct?
It's my oldest granddaughter. She lives next door, Amy Lou.
That's fabulous. Hello to Amy Lou. So, as I mentioned, the governor announced this reopening planning advisory group today. Are you engaged in a similar advisory role with the city on this phased-in plan for reopening in Boston eventually?
Well, what we really do to support Mayor Walsh is to make sure that he has the structures and the processes in place so people are collaborating on an effective basis. If they do that, then literally any decision that comes before the city can be made more effectively.
Then that includes the economic impact. Mayor Walsh has not missed an opportunity to say essentially he feels people's pain. He understands what this is doing to small business and workers and that sort of thing. But how is that integrated into the advice you were giving the mayor? Because obviously, ultimately, there will continue to be some risk regardless of when it is we reopen. But that's a balance that's got to be found, no?
That's right. There's no easy or perfect decision, so every different criteria has got to be considered. So what the mayor's doing is bringing all the different stakeholders with a seat to the table virtually, doing that on an effective basis, and then ensuring that the decisions that do get made have buy-in from the players, and they're implemented as effectively and aggressively as they need to be.
Did you know Mayor Walsh before this?
I had not met Mayor Walsh before this, but we've developed I think I have a deep respect for what he does, and I think a friendship.
You know, can we step back from this for a minute and look at the larger picture, if you will? In the past, you have used words like immoral and untruthful to describe the president of the United States. I think that was in the context of him saying that ISIS had been defeated or some similar sort of things. What words would you use to describe his leadership in this COVID-19 crisis?
Well, I think each of us have got to put our own judgment on President Trump's performance here. So it's not me to put a stamp on it. What I would say is what I'm looking for in leaders is candid integrity. I'm looking for leaders who show real commitment and empathy for the people who are affected by this, and then those who can also give us some inspiration for the future.
Are we getting candid integrity and empathy and inspiration from this president, General?
Well, I think one of the great things we're seeing right now is we're seeing leadership emerge at the mayoral level, at the governor level, from across the nation. And so what we're realizing is leadership in America is not one person. It's a community of people.
Why are you reluctant to characterize how you think the president is doing? I mean, he is the man ultimately in charge of this crisis that has engulfed 325 million people, General.
Because we risk focusing on the wrong thing. What we need to focus on is what we as a society are doing, what we as leaders are doing, the body of our leadership. If we focus it on our likes or dislike of any single person, I think we miss the point.
Well, let me give you an example today. I don't know if you've heard that when the president was asked the question about additional assistance to states and local communities and cities, he said something like, I'm not going to pay for the mistakes of the past 25 years. And then he went into something that he often talks about is, and I'm paraphrasing, but essentially he said so-called sanctuary cities. And Boston is one, by the way. I'm not going to fund that sort of thing either. So his decision-making may have a direct impact on your work and Marty Walsh's work and the people of Boston. What do you think about that?
Well, we always fight the war we have, this time against COVID-19, in the conditions we have it. And so what we do is we take into account where leadership is, where it isn't, and we focus and try to get the job done.
I'm going to take one more shot at this, if I may. The president has basically said, with a couple of asides, that it is every state for itself. 50 boats on their own deciding how to deal with this. As a former commander, is that the way this thing should be run?
No. If you think about if you're going to defeat an enemy, what you try to do in the military is break them into piecemeal and destroy them that way. If you don't want to get defeated, you unite. The United States ought to be 50 United States facing this together.
So now I'm going to turn to something I know you're going to want to talk about. You run, this is a totally, well, it is actually related, but aside.
Stop it.
I'm willing to talk to her, too, if she wants to talk, General. General, you are the chair of the board of something called the Service Year Alliance. Could you explain what it does and how its work is interacting with what's going on in this country right now?
I absolutely can. The Service Year Alliance is based on the idea that any of us who serves the community, whether it's in uniform, it's as a medical person, an educator, does two things. One, they help society, but second, they grow themselves. If we think about the experience that most of us grew our idea of citizenship from, it was when we had to create or we had to contribute to something larger than ourselves. When we do that, something grows inside of us. The people who serve City Year, Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, they vote at 3 times the rate percentage as people who don't.
I should say proudly, my daughter was in City Year here in Boston, so I know it. But, you know, I was using this as a ruse to get to a pet issue of mine, which is, do you support the notion of mandatory civilian service for young people in this country, where every, let's say, high school graduate would give back to their community or a neighboring community 1 year of their life with some stipend so they could learn what life is like beyond their borders?
Well, you know, it's interesting. You and I might agree that mandatory would be a great thing, but in reality, it's very unpopular with people of every age group. I'd like to see every person feel culturally required to serve. I'd like the idea that nobody would dare run for office unless they'd done some kind of service. But making it mandatory always brings a question: would you put them in jail if they didn't? And the answer is probably no.
Don't worry, I'm not going to bring up the guy who didn't do any service before this. Before you go, I know your grandkid is beckoning.
No, there. I got my second one in here now.
What is your expectation of when a phased-in reopening could begin to happen here in Boston?
Well, I think that what's going to happen is there's going to be a very realistic look at the numbers, and there's going to be a decision that parts of the business community, because the city has to operate, it's going to be very carefully done. I know Mayor Walsh is very thoughtful about doing it in a way that won't let the numbers rise again, but it'll still be a test.
Do you think, lastly, General, do you think there are lessons that we will have learned, leaders like you, Mayor Walsh, and the people of Boston that will have learned that will change how we lead our lives and lead our cities in the future from this pandemic?
Yeah, just a second, darling. I'm sorry.
That's perfectly okay.
Here, come here. Because the TV works better.
Are there lessons we'll learn that will carry forward into the future?
I think so. I think this is going to be the memory of our generation. It's going to be what happened before and after. All of us are going to look in the mirror and say, what did we do during the big pandemic? Did we live up to our expectations of ourselves? Can we look our granddaughters in the eye and say, we did what we should? Were we honest? Did we serve? I think that's the great opportunity. We're seeing leaders arise, like Mayor Walsh, that we might not have paid attention to before. I can't even run my house, much less help run the city.
General, can I tell you, I love that your grandkids were there, and it was a pleasure to meet you as well. Thanks so much for your time, General. I appreciate it.
It's my honor. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.